Global Perspectives and Psychedelic Poetics is what it says in the propaganda, which I assume is simply permission to rave about whatever comes to mind. Global Perspectives. I guess what I could say about this, from a psychedelic perspective, the thing that is different for psychedelic people looking at the global dilemma that we're in and that continues to deepen around us, is that it's, from my point of view, permission to hope rather than despair, because I think that processes, institutions that for 1,000 years or more have been building toward some kind of symmetry break, some kind of definitive self-revealing moment, that we now are turning final, as pilots say. We're now deeply embedded in the pattern. We can see enough of what's ahead of us to begin to actually feel the texture of the end of human history. It's no longer an abstraction. Even the straight people who own the world with their long-term and short-term projections, looking at population growth, spread of greenhouse gases, disappearance of the ozone hole, rising third world expectations, so forth and so on. When you propagate all these trends, it seems very clear that business as usual is no longer an option. Nobody's talking about that. So we're either in some kind of final fatal meltdown of the values of Western civilization, revealed now after 1,000 or 2,000 year run to essentially be bankrupt, or we're going to transform ourselves unrecognizably. There really isn't any middle ground. The most radical and least likely future of all, it seems to me, is a future in which we continue just to stumble forward as we have been since the Industrial Revolution. That's no longer an option. And so then the question becomes a sort of a Gnostic conundrum. Is this the final act of some kind of great cosmic tragedy in which intelligence rises out of the slime, is shown to be inadequate and sinks back into the slime? Or is this, a tale of difficulty overcome and heroism won? And are we going to be able to shed the monkey nature and shed the ego and actually move up to some kind of shining ideal? If you think of us as the descendants of the angels, this is a pretty tatty circumstance we've come to rest in. On the other hand, if you think of us as the descendants of shit-hurling apes screeching through the treetops, then it's pretty amazing what has been accomplished here. One of the dilemmas that I feel very strongly, and I'm just sort of talking off the top of my head here, because whenever a crowd is small enough, I sort of feel like I'm in my own living room. We don't have to have the pretense of knowing lecturer and, eager to be educated audience. The real challenge, I think, is trying to decide what is baggage and what is ballast that's going to have to be dumped. Can the future be a celebration of humanness as we have known it, meaning in the animal body with all its joys and pains, with all its frailty and potential for ecstasy? Or is what we call human nature somehow transcendental? And Did we only rest for a moment in the monkey body, as once the cutting edge of evolution must have rested in the great reptiles, and at some earlier phase in history rested in the fish, and so on? Is consciousness something uniquely human, and must we keep the animal body with us? Is our destiny to become the gardener caretakers of a revivified earth? Or is the earth like a placenta of some sort that we have literally sucked all the nutrition and potential out of because we're on our way to some grander, higher domain of being? I don't have the answer to these kinds of questions. I feel it very poignantly. It's very poignantly focused in the psychedelic, in the experience of psychedelic plants and psychedelic shamanism, because, you know, as any of you who have followed my ideas on this know, I've spent a lot of time in the Amazon basin with human populations that seem to have struck some kind of dynamic balance with the earth. And yet the paradox of that dynamic balance is that when you take the sacraments, the hallucinogenic plants of these people, you're propelled into worlds of science fiction-like strangeness, transcendental dimensions of titanic implication. And then, at least I personally have come to the realization that this is how those cultures have chosen to deal with the Faustian impulse in human beings. It's been somehow confined in the domain of the imagination. We, meaning we who trace our ancestry back to Europe, are part of a different style, a different strain of human being, if you will. We are the idea excretors, not satisfied to have a canoe, a net, 5 fish hooks, and a bowl, but instead we take matter, we, Western civilization, Western technology, and we impress upon matter ideas, millions of ideas, cities like Manhattan, high-performance weaponry, enormous works of art. All of this is a kind of impulse, very strong in Western human beings, to bring the ideas out of the domain of mind and to somehow solidify them in matter. Permanence. The cult of the West is permanence. I always feel that when you can find the obsessive center of a society, you probably have put your finger on its central neurosis as well. I remember when I spent time in India, India is rife with talk of Shakti. Shakti is energy conceived of in various ways. It can be sexual energy, or it can actually be electricity flowing through wires, is called Shakti. And I realized, being in India, that the Indian obsession with Shakti was the consequence of there not being any. That this was a society where energy had become the hardest commodity to encounter. And I think in the West, permanence is our great bugaboo, because we are born into the realization that everything is slipping through our fingers at the very moment that it comes into existence. The hardest psychedelic truth to assimilate, and you don't have to take psychedelics to assimilate this. If you just live, this will be hammered in on you again and again. And it's not, well, it's a cause for exaltation. It's a cause for despair. It's that nothing lasts. Nothing lasts. You know, not your fortune, not your misfortune, not your lovers, your enemies, your children, ultimately not even your own life and body. Everything fades. And so the Western response to this is the attempt to create something permanent, civilizations, enduring ideas, enduring institutions. All this is doomed to failure. And I see this Western obsession with the cult of permanence as a consequence of the Western obsession with ego. Ego, to my mind, is the very thing, if you had to somehow meld each problem into the next problem to try and reduce all problems to one, what you would eventually come to is the realization that ego is what is destroying us. You see, boundary dissolution is what is needed here. Boundary dissolution of all type. Our separateness is an illusion. There is a kind of human bedrock. That's why I think that the world sweep toward democracy is far more than simply a political trend. Democracy is not exactly a style of government per se or exclusively. Democracy is a biological institution of some sort, because there is no theory, there is no abstraction, there is no ideology. I mean, democracy is as close as you can get to anarchy and still have any theory of organization at all. You know, I wrote a book which is around and about called The Archaic Revival. And that's why my belief in the Archaic Revival is what brings me out to events like this. I mean, I think the term New Age and some of these other terms are pretty trivializing and basically designed by the mavens of marketing to draw you in. But there is an impulse throughout the 20th century in Freudianism, in abstract expressionism, in Dada, psychotherapy, sexual permissiveness, psychedelic experimentation, jazz, rock and roll. These are all facets of an impulse toward the archaic, toward the primitive, the non-straight, the anti-bow tie, the wish to blow up the staid world created by the fine ladies and gentlemen of the 19th century with their Christer ethics and their long dresses and all of that business. There is an impulse toward the archaic. This is very healthy. This is what happens when a society seeks to revivify itself. When the medieval world exploded in the face of the Italian city-states and the new classes that were emerging, they reinvented classicism. It was actually the second time classicism had been rediscovered. It was also trotted out by the Arabs in the 9th century when they needed a stabilizing metaphor for the Umayyad Caliphate and those civilizations. Now, in the 20th century, we can't go back to ancient Greece and Rome or Babylon. And in a sense, the New Age, I think, is an effort to go back to a kind of a Minoan/Egyptian world, which never existed except perhaps in the minds of certain menopausal theosophists. But the impulse is laudable, however screwy the results. But I think we have to reach further back, that all of history is what our text, the Bible, tells us it is. It's a confusion, a kind of punishment, a wandering in the wilderness, and that where we really want to be is naked, singing in the rainforest, stoned and exalted, one with the souls of the ancestors, one with the Gaian spirit of the planet. And I don't mean to imply that psychedelics simply act negatively, dissolving ego, dissolving social constructs, dissolving programming and neurosis. That's all true, but what is left when all this dissolving has taken place, is not simply a tabula rasa, a clean slate. What is left is what we forgot, what we have been so long away from, which is a connection into the reality of the Gaian mind. The great news that all shamanism can attest to and is built on is the news that there is a sentient, minded, caring entity that surrounds and holds the planet in its hands, in its heart, and beyond comprehending. I mean, call it Gaia, call it God, call it the spirit of nature. It doesn't matter what you call it. It transcends the rational apprehension of higher primates. And yet it is there. We know that our own peculiar form of self-reflection emerged in just a couple of million years out of animal organization. Well, what we don't know is how many other forms of mind there are possible, and how many times in the 2 billion year history of life on this planet, intelligence has been able to shed the dark chrysalis of matter and launch itself into nearby dimensions in which it finds completion and happiness. And I think that this is the great news that informs the shamanic religions, that we are not alone, and that the other that we can make our way toward is not, a galactarian intelligence from Beta Reticuli that is part machine symbiote, part banana slug, or something like that. That the coherent-minded entity that we make our way toward is actually a reflection of what is best in our hearts, that we carry in ourselves the seed of this thing, and that we are like the guy in the story of the prodigal son. We have fallen into history, and out of this misfortune, out of this experience, we can make gold if we return to the fold of the ancestors, if we can somehow take what we've learned from history and fold it back into the experience of being truly human. And this is the challenge. And it faces us on the political level, issues such as, all kinds of community issues such as racism and sexism and classism. These are community issues. And then issues between the human community and the planet. Our inability, you see, to emotionally connect with the consequences of what we're doing. I mean, we as a species present a perfect picture of pathology because what real psychotic behavior is behavior that one cannot emotionally connect with the consequences of what is being done. And when you realize that we are literally looting the cradle of future human life, that we have decided that we are not simply transient occupiers of this domain, but that it is ours to trash, to use up, to do with as we wish, leaving nothing for the future, then you realize the depth of our need for immediate and widespread therapeutic, indeed pharmacological intervention on our state of mind, because we have wandered from anything like real human values. And the reason psychedelics are so threatening in this society is because they immediately throw into high relief the internal contradictions of the dominator's style of doing business. And this is what must happen. The momentum toward catastrophe, built up over centuries, is immense. The only antidote to that I've seen, extrapolating from what I've seen it do to single individuals, are the shamanic hallucinogens. Because when you cut right to the bone, What has to happen is we must change our minds. If we don't change our minds, we're going to go down with this self-generated Titanic called Western civilization. And we have the power to change our minds, but it won't come from hortatory preaching. If that would work, then we would have turned the bend at the Sermon on the Mount. But as it is, I think we turned the bend sometime in the 20th century, either when Albert Hoffman invented LSD, or Gordon Wasson found the mushrooms of Oaxaca, or Richard Schultes brought back news of ayahuasca from the Amazon basin. You see, we have to humble ourselves. We have to give up the Titanic, ego-driven idea that we can do it by ourselves, as religions and yogans and all that beady-eyed crowd are into promising. The first step on the path of real self-transformation is the admission that you must humble yourself so thoroughly that you need to form a pact with an organism that begins its life in a mound of manure. You know, it's a true alchemical journey. As it is passed before you, as you look into it, you have a very strong and, I believe, genuine impression that this thing that you're being shown, though it's no larger than a Kaiser roll, is somehow absolutely confounding to the principles and assumptions of this world. That, in other words, if I could condense this thing into my hand right now, I wouldn't have to convince you. I wouldn't have to preach to you. I could just show you. Say, look at this. And in the visual confrontation with this thing, it's self-evident that this is impossible. Matter, light, they don't behave this way. It's as though you have brought back a chunk of another dimension. And then what they're saying about these things is, you can do this. Do what we are doing. And then the urgency becomes almost strident. They say, do what we're doing. Do it now. And you say, and then you feel, or I felt at any rate, an upwelling in myself, like a calling forth. Then out of my mouth comes language, or at least syntax, but without meaning. Some kind of glossolalia, where the modality of language is preserved, but the meaning is not. And it's a kind of an ecstasy. It sounds like gibberish in three-dimensional space, but in that space, it seems to be the key to unlocking a world made out of syntax and meaning. And I come before you with all of this stuff unfinished. This is not a teaching or a system or anything. It's an eyewitness account of a hyperdimensional automobile accident or something. We're not saying what the conclusions are. We don't know what the conclusions are. But this is big news. And when I first encountered this kind of stuff, I was a young art historian at the University of California, and I assumed that any motif, no matter how outré or bizarre, you would be able to look at the painting, folklore, and sculpture of somebody on this planet and find a trace. And it seemed as though this defeated that idea. It was almost counter the idea of the collective unconscious, because it argued that you, Joe anybody, Sally somebody, can break through on your own, an ordinary person, to a place that Verrocchio never saw, Michelangelo didn't anticipate it, Yeats didn't know, Blake hadn't a clue, Melville wasn't briefed, and yet there it is, you know. And this is, to me as an intellectual, it was very confusing, because I think as intellectuals we always assume that progress will be built on the shoulders of the giants that have preceded us. The idea of something actually 100% brand new and unexpected is pretty daunting. And here it was, 30 seconds away, simply by the act of ingesting this natural neurotransmitter. Well, those of you who've been there know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you who haven't been there, I can't imagine how you can even sit through this kind of thing, because, you know, it makes the folks from the Pleiades and all that other stuff out there seem mundane by comparison. The other thing is, we're not talking about camping out in cornfields night after freezing night with your eyes glued to the stars in wan hope. This is a no-fail method for plunging deeper into these spiritual realms than the tantric yogas or the practitioners of X, Y, or Z dare scarcely suppose. It's repeatable. It's on demand. It does not depend upon your state of moral purity or, tantric accomplishment. It's something that is our birthright, as much as our sexuality, our language, our eyesight, our appreciation of music. It's an innate human thing. And, to try and return to the premises of your question, I tried to formulate theories about what could this be. Well, the first impression that I had, based on a reading of how weird this all was this must be a parallel continuum, a la Philip K. Dick and like that just apparently over some kind of neurological energy barrier that's all around us all the time, these things are there. And they are not made of matter, so the laws of physics don't apply. And, like that. And then I entertained different possibilities, and I still entertain numerous possibilities because I haven't got it figured out yet. One possibility is that these things are actually human beings from the future. I mean, if you take the content of the experience seriously and say, I am apparently in contact with diminutive English-speaking creatures of some sort, well then they have got to be either intelligent beings from another part of the universe or humans from some extraordinarily advanced future world where human beings are now made of language and are only 2.5 feet tall. So I would put it rather far in the future. Or, and I just simply offer this in the spirit of intellectual completeness, if you ask a shaman or what these things are, they don't hesitate. They just say, oh, well, those are the ancestor spirits. This is what it's all about, is ancestor spirits. Well, it takes a while for the implications of this to sink in. They're talking about dead people. That's what an ancestor spirit is. They're suggesting that the dearly departed do not evanesce into sunlight or something cheerfully non-specific like that, but that this actually is simply one level of a cosmic system of some sort where birth and death are transitions from level to level. Well, this is just exactly the kind of thing that I'm intellectually set up to doubt and to feel a kind of scorn for, because, people have been running around since time immemorial claiming this sort of thing with an incredibly underwhelming body of evidence to back them up. And yet, if you try to approach the problem scientifically, I think you would agree that in terms of likelihood, although operating in this realm, what this means, I'm not sure, but that in terms of likelihood, it's more likely that these are human souls in another dimension than that we are being contacted by friendly extraterrestrials, or even that we share the earth with an invisible race of syntactical, tribal elf legions of some sort. But I think this conclusion is the one that we would tend to resist most strenuously. I mean, I think it's the most intellectually challenging position to take vis-a-vis Western thinking, to claim that we have to reopen the question of life after death. in a serious way, not the cheerful round of reincarnation that haunts some of the zanier offshoots of Eastern religion, but actually say, William Blake used to say, nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. And this seems literally to be true. It seems as though, something once articulated, a statement, the reverberations are unto the last syllable of recorded time. Somehow it's all there. Now, when I said these things approached and spoke in English, I didn't mean to make it sound as mundane as it might sound. Greek religion was characterized by what was called the Logos in the Hellenistic period. And the Logos was an informing voice. And all the great thinkers of Hellenistic times, Plato, Socrates, Xenophon, Thucydides, all of these people were in contact with the Logos. It was the sine qua non of Hellenistic religion. And it was a speaking and informing voice that tells you the right way to live. Well, we don't know what to make of this. And at a certain point in the evolution of the Western mind, judging by the writings of people who were contemporaneous with those times, the Logos fell silent. There was actually a date. Some of you may know the story of the fishermen pulling their nets off the Isle of Rhodes, and they heard a voice from the sky say that great Pan is dead. And this was at the change of the eon, the beginning of the age of Aquarius. It was almost as though there was something in the ancient world that has gone latent, that we can no longer touch or imagine. Gordon Wasson, who discovered with his wife Valentina the mushrooms, told a very interesting story in one of his books about how in Mazatecan, the people who are speakers of Mazatecan, when they chant what the mushroom says, they have created a special form for this, which goes like this. Zabuzz, 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 sa. This word sa means says. Zabuzz, 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 says. Says. I didn't know this at the time I took mushrooms the second time, and in my head I heard the mushroom speaking in English but adding the word says to the end of the sentence. So it was almost like, this thing could speak in Mazatec, it could speak in English, but it always kept its cadence and its structure. The other thing about psilocybin and the DMT thing is that it seems to be a catalyst for glossolalia. This is why I think it must have had something to do with the evolution of language. I mean, when you take psilocybin, you can fall spontaneously into states of glossolalia. Sometimes on DMT, it's almost impossible to control. It just spontaneously comes out. Yeah. Oh, what is glossolalia? Glossolalia, well, here's an example of it, then I'll define it. Sie ding quap maktiki pitech kveng huade molde ruf nubka kenget e fapstitulch kvem bedigen hegentetecht. It's language-like activity in the absence of meaning. And it's a very interesting thing neurologically, because notice that speech, ordinary speech, is this highly variable stream of data. We are set up to make these small mouth noises. As a public speaker, I'm very aware of the fact that one can speak without tiring almost longer than you can do any other major human motor activity. And but the glossolalia, such as I just did, it is clearly under the control of rules, but it is not, there is no meaning conventionally conceived of there, but there is syntax. And I think probably that language was invented millennia before meaning, and that you could almost call language toneless singing, and that people used to sit around the campfire and amuse each other by making funny noises. As a kid, I used to do this. And then it was only much, much later that anything approaching linguistic conventionality was imposed on this, and that that's a lower function. The other thing I want to say about this glossolalia thing is, you may say, well, you're just making it up when I do that. But really, the experience I have when I do it is that I stand aside, then this variable data stream comes out through my mouth. Well, now, it has to reflect something about me. It's a statement about my internal situation in that moment. And it's evolving and changing as rapidly as if I were saying, you know, I had a migraine headache last night, and I got up about 4 and took an aspirin, and you know, I'm telling you about my situation. But the glossolalia must be speaking to something about my situation, or it wouldn't be possible to do it at all. Not only is something not real unless it can be said, but the contrapositive of that is that once something can be said, it becomes almost too real. It displaces other possibilities. I mean, so we're living in a set of constructs, some architectural, some ideological, and they can be very oppressive. I mean, how do you get rid of the notion of linear time and space? Very easily. It's the slow work of consensus. One of the things that I feel I'm doing very consciously in these kinds of meetings is we're trying to launch and replicate memes. You all know this concept? A meme is the smallest unit of an idea, in the same way that a gene is the smallest unit of organism. And so these things, DMTLs, transcendental object at the end of history, so forth, these are memes. And in the same way that genes are copied and spread around, and that fidelity of copying is the key to genetic success, fidelity of meme replication is the key to communication. I mean, if I give a speech on something and then you hear it and then you go out and somebody says, so what did he say? And you give a completely cockeyed account of what has been said, well, then the meme has been betrayed. But if you can actually transfer the meme to somebody else's mind, and then they can copy it and pass it on, then the meme, it's almost as though the ideological environment were like a rainforest or a coral reef. Evolution is taking place. Stupid memes, dumb memes have short lifetimes, and they disappear, you know. And memes of great power are able to thrive in many intellectual and ideological niches, and to make many marriages of convenience with other memes, and so they are stabilized and passed along. Somehow we have to become hip to the power of language. And instead of just willy-nilly creating linguistic structures sort of ad hoc, we need to begin to consciously engineer our linguistic intent. And then, you know, so far in the 20th century, this has not been a program with a very happy history, because only jerks have gotten a hold of it. Nazis and people with narrow social programs. They say, you know, we're not going to call each other Mr. and Mrs. or hey you. We're going to call, everybody's going to call each other comrade. And then this will create the notion of comradeship, which to a certain degree it does. But the rainforests themselves may eventually be saved. Very large conservation organizations are attempting to do that. But the medical knowledge of how to use these plants is being lost at a tremendous rate. It will disappear in the next 30 years. There's no question about that, because these people are the young people are not learning the shamanism. They're moving into the cities, and you only have to break that kind of chain in an oral tradition. You only have to have a one-generation break, and the 50,000 years of accumulated medical information is gone. So even in today's high-tech world, 85% of all drugs sold over the counter can be traced to plants. So if we're serious about, a cure to aid, new kinds of contraception, new forms of psychoactive drugs, then this botanical database needs to be preserved. I think that those of us who are experienced with psilocybin are in a position now to offer answers to one of the most perplexing questions in the entire field of biology, which is, how did it happen that over a very brief period of time, less than 2 million years, the brain size of our species doubled, and in doubling became the fastest transformation of a major organ ever recorded in the history of the evolution of life. This is according to Lumsden, who's a very respected evolutionary biologist. This is a truly perplexing problem for evolution. It would be perplexing were it to occur anywhere in the animal phylogeny. But what's of particular embarrassment here is that it occurs in the phylogeny of the animal who invented the theory of evolution. So, it's particularly embarrassing. If we can't account for our own evolution, what depth and breadth has the theory when applied to the rest of nature? And, one notion has been that you're looking for a transitional skeleton or intermediate forms. This has now been given up. And by looking at this problem, I have sort of been able to, I think, generate let's call it an idea, a myth, a fantasy, an explanation for our predicament. And it goes very briefly something like this. All primates have what are called dominance hierarchies, male dominance hierarchies. This goes clear back into very primitive primates like squirrel monkeys. And it is true of us as we sit here in this room. We also have dominance hierarchies, male dominance hierarchies. This is why, what the squawk is in the gender issue is that men have been running everything for a long, long time. But I maintain that there was a period in the history of the primates when male dominance hierarchies were interrupted. And they were interrupted by the presence of an unusual element in the food supply. And this element in the food supply was psilocybin. And it acted as a kind of inoculation or unconscious vaccination against the formation of ego. And that at that moment, with ego, tendency to male dominance, chemically suppressed by mushrooms in the diet, all the qualities that we take to be most human and most ennobling in ourselves emerged. Language, loyalty, community, courage, love, devotion, self-sacrifice, planning. All of these things which distinguish us from the rest of animal nature, I maintain, occurred under the catalytic influence of an exogenous neurotransmitter in the environment that was having profound effects on a monkey that was exploring a new environment and a new dietary habit. And here's the notion. Our remote ancestors reached a kind of evolutionary climactic stability in the arboreal forests of tropical Africa. And like most animal species, that successfully occupies a niche of some sort, we would have stayed that way for millions of years at equilibrium, happily eating fruit and occasionally hurling shit at each other as we conducted ourselves through the forested treetops. And thought would never have entered into the matter. However, the plot thickened about 3 million years ago, when suddenly, and for reasons that are hidden in the heart of the planet itself, the planet began to dry, and the African continent became subject to waves of drought and desiccation. The tropical rainforests which covered Africa began to retreat and be intercut with grasslands. And in these grasslands, a very rich fauna of animal life developed. New kinds of animals, grass-eating, herding animals, ungulate animals, cows, bison, various forms of antelope, so forth and so on. Meanwhile, turning the camera's eye on our remote human ancestors, things are getting tougher up in the treetops. Less fruit, less habitat in which to forage, and whenever an animal gets under dietary pressure, it does what any sensible creature would do. It begins to experiment with new food. It begins to test food in the environment. Now, the reason animals don't ordinarily do this is because foods also contain toxins, and toxins sometimes are mutagenic. So the reason butterflies and birds and all kinds of animals specialize in their diets, it's a strategy to avoid mutation-causing chemicals. Well, so then what happens if you put an animal population under pressure for food and it starts experimenting with new forms of food? It begins having a higher incidence of mutation. And that mutation meets the selective forces of natural selection present in the environment, and lo and behold, you get sudden episodes of evolutionary advance. And I maintain that this is what happened to us on many levels. I mean, we are a kind of monkey, but if you set us next to our nearest relative, there are a lot of things about us that are different. Our hairlessness, the proportion of our skull to the rest of our body is a fetal ratio compared to other primates. Well, among the new foods encountered by these now ground-foraging proto-ancestors of ours were mushrooms growing in the dung of wild cattle in this grassland environment. Now, the astonishing thing about psilocybin in small doses, and this was secured by research done by Roland Fisher in the late 50s, early 60s, is that in very small doses so small that you don't feel buzzed or loaded or anything, in fact you don't notice it, visual acuity increases. You can give somebody 5 milligrams of psilocybin and an hour later give them a standard optometric test, and they will do better than if they hadn't taken the psilocybin. This is because edge detection is sensitized. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out if there's a food in the environment of a hunting and gathering animal that conveys increased visual acuity, it's the equivalent of chemical binoculars, then those animals which accept that food as an item in their diet are going to have greater hunting success than those individuals that do not. And greater hunting success means greater success at feeding your offspring. And that means that there would be an outbreeding of the non-psilocybin using members of the population. In other words, natural selection would then favor those animals admitting the mushroom into their diet. So that little chink in the armor, that little toehold, is sufficient for the long march toward the stars, which is taking place in our species, to begin. The next step is, if you take slightly more psilocybin, you experience what's called arousal. And arousal means a kind of general restlessness, an inability to sit still, a roving and wired kind of attention. And in highly sexed animals like primates, it also means sexual arousal, and in the male, sustained erection. A second factor promoting outbreeding of the non-psilocybin using members of the population. In other words, you see, it was promoting what anthropologists straight-facedly call more successful copulations. And you don't have to be straight-faced, however. So this is the second step, and I believe that the sexual style of these psilocybin-aroused early ancestors of ours was probably orgiastic. This seems reasonable from looking at the human styles on the earth today. And I suspect that probably an orgiastic religious style based on the worship of a great horned goddess who was honored at the new and full moon became a religious style that was set in place for 10 or 15,000 years. This is what was going on. Well, now, psilocybin on its own, and even more so in combination with a social style that included orgy, will have the consequences of dissolving. Human beings addict to approximately 20 or 30 substances, very tight physiological addictions, and then there's all our ideological addictions, to Marxism, to capitalism, to the Republican Party, you name it. And then we have behavioral addictions of all sorts. Somebody gets up in the morning and throws open their front door, and if the Times isn't lying rolled at their feet with a red rubber band around it, they go into shock because an addiction is being interrupted. The fix, which was supposed to arrive on time, has been delayed, and now this person stomps back into their house, menace to wife and child, because the newspaper didn't arrive on time. So this curious tendency of our species to addict, I think, is because, if a person is an addictive type, then people say, well, they probably were abused in childhood, and this is the consequence of some kind of childhood trauma. Well, I would submit to you that we exhibit this pathology. We appear to be the inheritors of some kind of dysfunctional relationship. And I maintain that it was torn from us at the birth of mind when we were forced out of the African Eden and into a much drier, harsher Middle Eastern climate, where we then had to toil in the vale of sorrows. Well, now, what is the point of this? Or is this just some revisioning of archaeology, some egghead game, or what is the point? Well, the point is that the consequences of this dysfunctional behavior stemming from ego and the dominance hierarchy in our behavior has ruined our planet, toxified the air and water, allowed our population to soar beyond the carrying capacity, poisoned our lives with propaganda, and made us each feel guilty, powerless, and doomed. I mean, this is the major riff being run in the society at large, is that we're doomed. We've looted the planet. We've destroyed our children's future. We have the ethics of rats, and now we're going to go down the tube. Well, I say, before we despair completely and just toss in the towel, We need to make one last try at escaping our demonic other, and that the way to do it is through, and this leads me by a Baconian recurso back to archaic revival. We need to reach back into time and attempt to understand what happened to us and how we fell into history and how its institutions have served us badly and diminished and degraded our humanness. And then we need to begin a fundamental reconstruction of human institutions with an eye toward creating a viable, balanced, nature-honoring, human-honoring set of institutions. So does this mean I advocate in a world of epidemic diseases that we return to orgies on every new and full moon? I don't think so. It's hardly possible. But what it does mean is that the tool which lay behind all these changes, which was the ego-dissolving power of psilocybin, needs to be looked at very carefully. We need to examine the possibility that we could re-engineer ourselves so that we could emotionally connect with the consequences of what we have been doing to ourselves and the planet. I mean, when people take psychedelics, this is what they realize. They lose the hold on their little world. You know, they're saving money for a Mercedes or breast implants or some damn thing. You know, then you take one of these things and then you get the big picture. And then you realize just where that Mercedes lies in, you know, the long march to the stars. In other words, we see this in the rainforest cultures today. They have no high level of material culture. And yet it's not because they're not interested in beauty or poetry. It's that they simply live in a much more mental world than we do. The peculiar obsession of the Western mind is its demonic relationship to matter, that we don't believe anything is real unless it's made of stuff. And, you know, any idea, any notion has to somehow be concretized. This is a kind of neurotic response, in my opinion. I mean, the cultures with those civilizations with no material culture whatsoever are in a much more dynamic relationship to nature. It's our obsession with stuff that is pushing us toward Armageddon. I mean, we seriously propose to bring every man, woman, and child on Earth to the level of the life standard roughly approximating that of the average dweller of this island. Well, I've got news for you. There isn't enough metal, glass, plastic, and petroleum in the planet to do that. And in fact, it's causing the toxification of our world. Unfortunately, we live under a social system that is stuff obsessed. We must have money in order to get things, and the number of things around that they're telling you you need is beyond your ever being able to satisfy yourself. We have been told that what is within is nothing, you know, and that all meaning lies in the exterior world. So only science has meaning, only property has meaning, and in fact, the felt presence of immediate experience is the only thing you will ever truly possess. The felt presence of immediate experience. It's that the quality of that determines whether you're a happy or unhappy person. And you can be dying of intestinal parasites in some hut in the Amazon, and if your felt quality of immediate experience is superior, then you're superior to the guy who's being chauffeured around in an air-conditioned limousine in some urban center somewhere. Our whole cultural delivery system denies this, you know? So we have the concept of entertainment and of drugs. I mean, to my mind, television is a far more insidious drug than heroin, and that they're very comparable. They're cousins. The difference between heroin and television is that at least on heroin you can think your own thoughts, On television, they don't even give you the option to do that. You know, you imbibe a manufactured data stream, the main purpose of which is to introduce you to the cosmetically enhanced surfaces of certain products which you don't need. The average American watches 6 hours of TV a day. This means that millions and millions of people are being maintained in a semi-larval stage. I mean, we might as well store them in enormous underground banks somewhere, and someday we may. I mean, this society is hard enough to manage. What if all these people unplugged themselves and began running around making demands on the political institutions and the infrastructure? Then we'd really have a problem. So better they should stay in the suburbs. People magazine is delivered. The telly is there. They trouble no one. But they do consume. There is no mundane future. I mean, if we had the chairman of the World Bank and those people here, they draw curves that will stand your hair on end. They show you that the world population, the extraction of petroleum, the rise of poverty, the poisoning of the atmosphere, the accumulation of toxins in the food chain. You draw all these curves and you discover that sometime between the year 2000 and 2040, life as we know it becomes absolutely impossible on the surface of this planet. That's what the sober, unstoned people say. So then the rest of us are supposed to come to terms with this in some sense, and you can either despair and say, well, then we're just, you know, the momentum of 1,000 years of chuckle-headedness is just going to slam us into the wall of planetary limitation at a speed of about 5,000 miles an hour, or we have to sort through our toolkit and find the right wrench to get this sinking submarine back up to the surface. Let's disarm Captain Nemo and his friends and put the people who want to go into the lifeboats, and then these clowns can do any damn thing they want to. Well, when you sort through the cultural toolkit, trying to find the magic key, it is